check, baby check, baby check. Let's check my sound levels. It is November 20th on a Monday. This is the first time I've actually had the energy to do a recording in a long time, and I'm already kind of messing this up because I'm doing this on my phone, and I just reinstalled the Spreaker app, and anyway, I think I'm going to put some background music to this at some point. I don't mean, like splice it in, but to actually have some background music playing, like just playing an actual song in the background, kind of get me in the mood, a sort of meditative thing. And these are kind of my meditations, so I think that's what I'm going to call all this, because I'm kind of sitting back here. It's nice and quiet, really nice temperature down here in southern Florida, and the last week and a half of November. It will drop a little bit, but it's really coming into that sweet period that I like, where you could even have like a really sunny day, but only be like 75 or 80. So yeah, basically, in any other place would be perfect weather. Here it's the kind of, fall/winter weather. Anyway, isolation. That's what I wanted to talk about a little bit. And I've been, oh my God, missed you guys quite a bit. It's been many, many moons since I've actually made a recording. Like I said, it's kind of medical reasons, kind of a mix. So it's great to be back and to have, it seems like massive amounts of caffeine surging through me just to kind of normalize me so that I can kind of act and, do things. I wish there was a better medical treatment available for it, but so far my doctors haven't really figured that out. But enough about my medical thing. That's just kind of a apology and an addendum to the apology. What's really going on, the things I actually want to talk about, are a little bit different. But I guess caused by my medical situation here, at least in part, is the isolation, specifically things I've gone through, but also what's happening in society, where it seems that we're becoming more isolated from each other as a function of society and how our society works, as opposed to some sort of pathology or some sort of medical problem. And it's one of the things that hit me. They talk about, like, I did some test. I forget what it's called. I forget what the paradigm is called, where they rate your personality. It's kind of like the Big Five, but it isn't. I think it's 4 dimensions. And I came up with introverted, intuitive, judging, feeling. Okay? Not that the judging feeling part is something I'm still kind of researching, trying to figure out. But introverted and intuitive both make a great deal of sense to me. That was pretty on the ball. Especially introverted. Speaking of the Big Five, I took the online version. I think Jordan Peterson had it on his selfauthoring.com, I believe it was, or futureauthoring.com. Either way, you could just Google Jordan Peterson. And I think one of his sites has the Big Five test that you could take, or he, has a link that puts you to that. Some company that does kind of a shortened version, because it's usually a much longer test. And I came up, there's an extroversion score, which is a paradigm of positive emotion. So I've never really understood that definition of it, but it measures how, one of the dimensions is to measure how extroverted or introverted you are, and they just call it simply extroversion. That's good coffee. And on the extroversion scale, I'm in like the 30s or something like that, which might be more indicative of what I'm going through. So that would kind of make me an introvert. Even if what I'm going through is affecting the score greatly, I'm probably still in the introverted category. And this other test, I forget who does it and what it's called. It has me as an INJF, so I'm introverted on that scale too. So that's pretty consistent. And that's not something I argue with. I do, and here's part of the theory, that social interaction is very draining, right? So I've noticed that people who have a lot of social interaction as a job, like in retail or in teaching, so they have this constant interaction. It's almost like those circuits get burned out a little bit at the end of the day, and you really don't want to deal with anybody. I knew a teacher, great girl, great woman, and she wouldn't even take texts half the time, or like Facebook messages. It was more of a, I'll see you when I see you, unless I'm actually like physically in your presence, like I don't want to hear from you, which is kind of off-putting, but at the same time understandable, right? Especially if, somebody's drinking like a gallon of coffee a day just to keep their energy levels up, because it's draining, right? Now, what's crazy about that, and many of you listening are probably introverts, so you don't relate. Some of you extroverts will relate, though. And I've kind of wrapped my head around this, and it's pretty understandable. People who are extroverted get energy from that, from these social interactions, as opposed to introverted people who kind of need to recharge from it. Now, the thing is that this view of introverts being like, I just want to be with my books, or I just want to be with my animals even, that could be kind of a form of extroversion that's kind of projected onto animals. And then you have people who are like really into books, or just watching movies alone and stuff like that. That's kind of a recharge time. That doesn't mean that they don't enjoy the social interactions. They just find them draining for whatever reason. My little pet theory is when you have a disorder that makes social interaction a little bit harder, whether it's being a little bit on the autistic spectrum, which is not, that's actually kind of normal if you think about it. It's not, it depends on where on that spectrum you are to become pathological. But you could be a little bit, it almost feels like there's an overlap, like you're kind of describing autism to a degree, like one aspect of it, and not really the, anything. You just kind of, it's difficult to socialize. You don't get the norms. You don't get the cues as easily as somebody else. Maybe your brain wiring is just a little bit different, and maybe it's wired more for, hunting, the ADHD gene theory that that it's more of a hunting type ADHD wiring, and that's why a lot of ADHD kids love video games, and they could sit there and concentrate on those video games forever. So it's they could pay attention to those video games, but in most other aspects they can't pay attention. So we have this kind of paradigm that's a little bit mixed up, a little bit hazy. But I guess the main theory to me, and what I get out of it, is that introverts, for whatever reason, and I won't go into them again, to save you that, in my mercy, for whatever reason, introverts have a little difficulty maybe, or maybe it's just some sort of natural drainage when it comes to, regarding social interaction, and that's it. That's just where we're at, and it doesn't have to be pathology or anything like that. And in fact, if so many of us are on the introverted side of the scale, then it's evidently not a pathology. It's a bell curve, and until you get a couple standard deviations off of the mean of the bell curve, until you become what's called an outlier, I don't think that looking at it as a pathology, especially if you look at it under the model of pathology, which is like, how is this interfering with your life? being quiet and having a few good friends as opposed to a bunch of acquaintances, that's not interfering with your life. There's kind of a different kind of life. That's kind of almost like a biologically wired culture within you, like a social subculture. And you will probably gravitate towards people who are like that, and people who are more gregarious will gravitate towards more gregarious people, and they will still have that kind of social cooperation. One of the theories behind, one of the driving theories, evolutionary psychology, through evolutionary psychology, I think we've gained that theory. Don't know if it's necessarily written by evolutionary psychologists, but the theory is that we have evolved to cooperate, and that's why we became a much more successful animal on the animal plane. So think of it, we're an animal, and we have to cooperate to get away from predators. You see that with other animals, right? And then you have, cooperation in hunting, like a pack animal. We had both, so that's already kind of a rare mix to have both. Many animals are either pack animals, or they kind of they're more like meerkats. I don't think they're you could really call them pack animals, but they are kind of communal, where they will help protect each other. But then when it comes to hunting, I think they're more they will do that individually, or at least in individual family units, as opposed to a pack hunt like a wolf. I could be totally wrong about both of those things, but that's my impression. But we go a step beyond that because we can communicate in more complex ways. Now, it's one thing to have a certain set of howls and barks and these kind of utterances that are just kind of different sounds. One might say, "Help! I'm being attacked. I'm being eaten currently." One might say, "Come here and help me eat this." There's these different sounds that we kind of go into that. We have like dog translators now that tell us that they can actually kind of tell a little bit of what the dog is trying to get at. So this is kind of like this basic emotional / situational. They can tell you the emotion coming from a situation, and you assume the situation. If we can do that effectively or not, I have no idea. But with a help, an aiuto in Italian, there's a actual utterance that means that. And of course it implies the situation a bit more strictly. And we have phrases, not just utterances. So it's a bit more complex, and it could be, you could tell somebody while hunting, go over there and wait 5 minutes, which you can't really do that with barks and howls. You can't really tell somebody a plan, right? It just has to kind of come together. And they're great at that. In many ways, they're more advanced at that than we are, even if we tried. But there is this higher level that we get to when it comes to communication, and when it comes to the inherent cooperation, and the power of that cooperation is just, what conquered the world. I mean, think about it. We were something less than chimpanzees, because remember, chimpanzees have evolved from whatever we split off from them as, so this like proto-chimp, and we became something on the other end, and chimpanzees became chimpanzees. One of the things that Dr. Jordan Peterson, I've mentioned him before, so I might as well mention him again. One of the things that he points out, and he loves to point out in a lot of his talks, is that if you put a bunch of chimpanzees in a room, chances are, one is going to become the alpha by tearing somebody apart. Maybe they won't like that alpha, and two betas just sub-alpha betas will get together and kill that alpha, and they'll literally like rip. When you talk about limb from limb, they will literally do that. And we are different in that, we may establish these social hierarchies, but we don't usually sit in a room and automatically think, it's time to rip this guy's arm off and eat him. So even when it comes to the primates who are a bit more advanced, or an entire evolution beyond them. So what does that have to do with isolation? Well, because we evolved as a very social animal, and I'm kind of trying to get across what we mean by social animal, that we can cooperate on this higher level. There's a whole bunch of details I'm kind of leaving out, but we, in effect, need each other to become this kind of higher animal, so to speak. Our higher functions often depend on that. Again, I'm leaving a lot of details out in my mercy. If you take a baby and you could feed it, supply it with, warmth and all that stuff. But if you do it without touching them, which is, if you do it in a natural way, baby will die. So we need touch. We need the handshake, the man hug, real hugs. I know that sounds kind of wishy-washy, but I'm not being, some sort of hippie when I talk about that. That's just, it doesn't have to be like you walk around and hugging on everybody. But that's what happens when people are isolated. And I personally got into a situation where I was socially isolated. Again, there were some medical things going on. So I got kind of a picture of this, and throughout my life I've had an issue or two that kind of led to isolation. And it's very easy to become depressed, to become unmotivated. There's almost a inherent motivation when you at least reach enough social activity where it's good enough. That's a concept I steal from a writer in psychology. I forget if she's even a doctor, but she talks about like the narcissistic family dynamic, and that really what we just need, we don't need perfect parents, and nobody's expecting them. But often pathology. Sorry, I got something on my lip. Anyway, pathology often stems from people not being good enough, because there's this a view of people who suffer from some sort of pathology that it's, they're just being kind of whiny or something like that, and it doesn't take much to be a good enough parent, evidently. But some people are devoid of those skills, usually because of their own pathology. And that can be almost like a first isolation, like a primary isolation, I might call it, which is leagues worse than subsequent social isolations. But those subsequent social isolations could also kind of bring up the power of that primary isolation. One of the theories, I think it was Rogers, was talking about, he did a lot of experiments with, I think it was bonobos. But anyway, he did a lot of animal experiments. And he established the, primary caregiver model and he stems some pathologies off of that. But one of the things he was saying is that you could be attached, securely attached. You could be insecurely attached, which is more of an anxiety thing, and you could be unattached, which is a mix of anxiety and depression, or at least that's what it commonly leads to. And that's, again, that kind of like primary lack of, for lack of a better term, non-isolation. Again, I won't go into too many details, but we need, especially during another concept is critical periods, when we're very, very young, we need to feel safe, to feel like our needs are being taken care of. Again, this is a good enough concept, not, a perfect parent that somehow is awake and around us 24/7, because that would be impossible. Parents have to sleep. Parents have to work. Parents have to do a lot of things, and of course, that's impossible. If we were hunter-gatherers, that's impossible. So in the modern world, that's just a good enough. But when does society take away a parent's ability to be good enough? I think that's when we start talking about like a primary isolation kind of coming along with society. And that's a really, really bad move for any society. If you can't attach to your parent or to some caregiver, it could be, a nanny even, but if you can't attach to somebody, it's kind of weird when it's not your biological parent and it's not your adopted parent, but, somebody who works for your parents. That's a little bit off in and of itself. But at least there's some sort of connection to somebody. But when you don't have any connection, you're kind of a latchkey kid from birth. Because of whatever strife, everybody's working, there's no time off from work, which is why I argue on the liberal side, because according to my traits and to theories about traits, and at least all the theories I've read, and political leanings, I think it's about 50-50. 50% is your biology and 50% is your upbringing. But anyway, according to a lot of these theories, I should be very conservative, and in some ways I am. But at the same time, I grew up in a Democrat household, probably beyond that, probably a little bit socialistic, and there are some views that have kind of given a shot because of that. So I'm an odd mix of liberal and conservatism, which makes me a person, so that's, kind of where it's at. If you're honest with yourself, I think everybody's kind of a mix too. Most people aren't purely conservative or liberal. I don't really count Democrat or Republican or as anything. They're just corporations that somebody has decided to ally themselves with. So I don't know if that's... I know in the past it didn't mean... it wasn't delineated so strongly. But I'm not going to get into the current politics of it. I think there's a much bigger question of this isolation that people have inherently from the society. At least we're pushing towards that. Now we say, it's great to have a mother and a father in the home, and there is a huge positive effect from not having just like a single mother or a single father, and having both parents in the home. We most often talk about the father in the home because we most often have the single mother. But there's an effect either way, I believe. That's my own belief. And, ooh, battery's getting low. I had a big giant power bank that was like 10,000 milliamps, but can't find the goddamn thing. It's a big brick, so I'm not sure how I misplaced that. Anyway, so I might have to cut this a bit short, but I don't think droning on would have served anybody's, would have been good for anybody anyway. So, isolation seems that there is a societal component right now, and that's a very big negative for any society. You need good enough parenting, and what's good enough parenting? Touching, support, being supportive. If people just kind of keep a kid in a constantly in some sort of basket and they never pick them up, you see how children react to that. They're always trying to cling on, and parents seem to complain anytime a child wants to be held. I always want to be held. I always want to be held. I think that they really have a skewed view, a lot of these parents, because they really just don't want to hold their child. It's kind of irritating. You're kind of holding like a bag of water. Think about holding 4 gallons of water or something like that. And like a giant balloon, it's like this wiggly, kind of hard to control type of thing. Or at least it can be. Sometimes they're obviously very quiet, especially when they're newborns. They just kind of get fetal, but they want to be, held by a parent. And then they have all day going without their parents, and you wonder why they cry so much at night. And I get it. I'm not blaming the parent. I'm blaming where we're going and how we're doing it. And yeah, there's the interaction where people are willing to do this to their children, but I don't think they understand what they're doing. And a lot of parents, if they knew, or if they could grasp the kind of damage that happens to children when they're not held enough, when they're not, and some babies admittedly are clingier than others, but they need to play. There's, if you watch any of Peterson's more developmental psych kind of tirades, where he goes into some of these things, it seems that, at least through research he's familiar with, or he's done himself as a researcher in conjunction with a lot of other researchers, that you need to play. There are literally circuits for play. I'll bring up this idea of circuits a lot because it's something that makes a lot of sense to me. So we have these circuits for playing. We need to kind of socialize. We need to test out, pull on daddy's lip until it hurts, and then, have daddy go, ooh, that's too far. Don't pull it that hard. And that's kind of a big part of our socialization. And if that doesn't happen for whatever reason, people have this kind of primary isolation. And then you get into a society that's exacerbating it, where, yes, we have this technology to be in touch all the time, but we're not really in touch. We're not touching each other. We're not in physical proximity. And that's especially, it seems, harmful when it comes to some sort of intimate relationship. You can't be so, you can't have a text-only relationship. You got to talk, you got to Skype, you got to be in each other's area, physical domain. And there's a lot of, yes, it can be draining, especially for people who are employed in a field that's already very social. I think we all, this is all more of a spectrum, and we all, to an extent, after a whole bunch of social interactions, we do get tired, just because it's, even if it's exciting for us and we're not initially drained by it, that we're initially stimulated by it. It's kind of like drinking tequila. Tequila is a stimulant, but eventually the alcohol within the tequila, boof, and you're going to drop. If you just sit there continuously drinking tequila, you're going to get drunk and you're going to throw up and you're going to pass out. I don't care how much of a stimulant it is. And I'm not sure how it is, but what substance in it is actually a stimulant. So we have this likelihood, let's call it, increased likelihood of being brought up without good enough parenting, sometimes no parenting, but more often it's just kind of crappy parenting. And of course, some parents do a great job. They just, maybe in a situation that allows them to do that. Who knows? They intuitively know that they need to play with their children. They enjoy it. Maybe they're more extroverted. Maybe that's an advantage. I haven't really seen, because people seem to act wildly differently with their kids than they do in other social situations. But I'm sure there's a bit of a correlate. And then we kind of produce these people who are, to kind of use the Clintonian term, the Hillary Clinton term, deplorables. But I don't use that in a necessarily negative way. I mean, it's not saying anything good about them, but I'm not saying that they're put there by their own inadequacies, etc. I think it's more of isolation. Then you have these digital interactions and interactions with digital entities, and that's not really a replacement. We can only kind of facilitate communication between people and dissemination of information and stuff like that. And yes, video games can do, can kind of hit that kind of hunter circuit, and that could be kind of a positive for them, but it's not social, and online games aren't social either. I think ideally, like one of the things I hate, I'm kind of the opposite of the texter. Definitely, I'm an introvert, so I definitely feel just text me. I don't need a bunch of information, or I don't need to really interact with you on a higher level. And, but that's sometimes, we all have our moods. But a lot of the time, even when I make a phone call, I'd rather have some sort of visual Skype type thing. Like, I hate calling the government for anything and just getting kind of and I mean like, the county, the state, not just a Fed. Wow, that's pretty loud. I don't have ducking on, so I don't know how loud that was for you. Sorry about that. Anyway, so these interactions, I actually want like at least audio visual, but I'd rather be in that office in front of that person. I know that sounds weird, because it sounds so inconvenient. So yeah, there is this kind of, I got to drive over there, but at least with friends, I want to Skype, and in the future share some sort of kind of augmented reality type thing, so we can go someplace together, like hang out in like a virtual concert, something like that, right? Even though I really don't like going to regular concerts. Again, introverted. Don't exactly dig crowds either. So the technology can be utilized for some sort of stepping stone to physical interaction, and that's great. But right now, I think a lot of people are looking for it to replace physical interaction, and that doesn't work. And I think the reason that if you look at people who go on social networks and the higher rates of anxiety and depression, and maybe even the exacerbation of that. I think that's more the issue. When I see the results, that's what I see. I see people trying to get that in some way. And while it's safe, you don't have that person physically in the room, so that's safe if they're a stranger and stuff like that. The safer you want to feel, the less you're going to feel connected. I might go into the Negan effect and stuff like that. Since we just had a Walking Dead, I used to do shows on that. And that's kind of related in a very odd way. I'll get into that in that show. This isolation that we feel when we just have this, especially when you just have these kind of shallow, I don't like this, I think this. I mean, I'm even guilty of that. I might be deeper than a lot of other commentators, but it's still not like the depth of conversation I would have when I could actually look at your expression and see how that last comment affected you. And then I could, why was that such a strong, almost like a therapist, but, as a friend, and just being, kind of an intuitive person, somebody who's very observant of other people's emotional states, a sort of hypervigilance that I carry around with me for God knows what reason. And most of us have some sort of, we all have empathy to a certain extent, unless you're an actual, one of the rare, like the unicorn of psychology, the true psychopath, as opposed to the lower empathy person. So we all have some sort of empathy. And we all have some sort of kind of ability to read a little bit of other people's emotions. It's just on a spectrum. Like, obviously, someone might make a face and I'll see it and I'll go, oh, you're angry. Like I'll mentally register that. Other people, it may take them like throwing, banging their shoe on the desk or something like that. And I've literally seen that where somebody would look angry and it looks like everybody else in the room doesn't even understand that they're angry. And they're blatantly, obviously angry to me. And it looks like everybody else in that room, even though they're paying attention to the person, it seems, doesn't realize that they're angry until they, take off the shoe or, start throwing things. And it's a mystery to me, but I guess that's just a little bit more of a skill that I have for whatever reason. Anyway, so we're not going to get that depth. You get a little bit of it through Skype. Like I said, you can read facial expressions, especially if you're an intuitive. You can kind of read that a little bit better. Another word for that may be empathic. And there's almost like a feeling you get when you're in the room with somebody. It's like a less sterile environment, if that makes any sense. You get their smells, you get their, maybe it might be pheromones, I don't know. But there's these things, there's these kind of interactions we get physically that you don't get through the digital environment. And no matter how good it gets, and like I said, it's great in its applications if that's all you want right now. Maybe you just want the text, maybe you just want the phone call, maybe you just want the Skype, even though you're really intimate with somebody. I think it's no mistake that if you look at the military, they do the whole Skype thing. I think that's kind of the best we can get right now until we get to some sort of like augmented reality type thing where we could kind of be in the same room with each other digitally. But that still won't be the same. And we shouldn't look to replace our physical interactions with digital interactions. It's just not going to work. So it's kind of doomed from the beginning. And unfortunately, many of us are in a position where it seems like our only outlet, our only road to physical interactions is through digital media. And it's should be more that you have people that you know and that you've interacted with in the past, and now you can, interact with them across the country, or you can interact with them, maybe at night talking to your best friend. You could Skype with them, and it's better than just like a couple texts back and forth, more intimate, so to speak. And it could kind of help you get by until you see each other again. But we need those social interactions, especially amongst family. And we're not getting it within our families, within our kind of cultural groups. More and more, we're becoming like Facebook groups. And that's not adequate. There's a lot of effects of community. I remember hearing from somebody that a generation ago or two, depending on how you count generations, you would have people around your age or a little bit older within the community that you can interact with, who could be kind of reciprocal big brothers, big sisters, or actual kind of replacements for that. So you'd have these kind of almost sibling-like relationships with the people in your community. And then you'd have adults in your community who could be adults in your life, as opposed to just your parents, just your teacher. There would be, neighbor Bob. I remember I had a neighbor who was really good, really handy, really good at that kind of thing. And he was the one who taught me when I was young how to do drywall, because my house had those slats. It didn't have drywall. It just had those like wood little boards that almost looked like long painter sticks. And then plaster was put over top of it. So there was a lot of times when that plaster would be coming down and we'd have to patch it or replace it. House was a mess, because of that. That was like a big deal with the walls. They seemed to always be cracking and pieces falling out and all that stuff. That was something that my neighbor taught me. My father had arthritis. He wasn't able to do many of those things. He was amazed that I could, because his hands just did not work that way. They didn't work to that extent, and from a very young age. So for me to be able to do this perfectly flat patch of a wall where you couldn't tell that it was a patch was amazing to him. All right. But my neighbor was there, and he was very handy, and he would teach me that, and sometimes automotive things when I'd, fix up a car, replace something on the car, whatever car I had at the time, or my father's car, etc. So there's this value that we get from having people in the community. And it's not all good, but it's also not all bad. And we need to get to a point where we allow more people into our kids' lives, where it's not just a play date. We shouldn't make the mistakes that our parents made. We should start letting our generation, play with the kids next door. I know that's happening. I see that happening on the weekends with my sister's family. When I see them, actually, no, it's not during the weekend. It's, just any day. She gets home a little early, and we're there, and they'll be, just coming back from playing with the neighbor's kid or the neighbor's kids, and like a whole group of kids from the neighborhood. And that, they say that the middle-class lifestyle in suburbia is actually more isolating. But I think it's really, if you keep your kids from playing with the neighbor's kids, and you don't trust the parents and all that kind of stuff, I'm sure you may have a reason. You may, that specific neighbor may be, like way out there. and you don't want them to like abuse your children, but without evidence to the contrary, you should assume that they're just normal people having a normal life, trying to get by. I mean, they're in a decent middle-class neighborhood with you. They probably aren't so bad. So until you know otherwise, you got to kind of risk the negative in order to get the positive. Because the negative is a risk, but the positive is almost always there. Interacting, social skills training, etc. So isolation, and often it's become self-isolation because it's just kind of what you know, or you have a medical issue when you don't have the energy, etc., etc. So I guess that's my kind of meditation on isolation. I love to do these recordings in the morning when I wake up, and they give me ideas for more of a lineation of a subject. And every once in a while, after dozens and dozens of these morning recordings, which was one thing I did over the last 6 months, I haven't been doing my little show here, my little meditations. I would do every morning, just recording myself, kind of babbling, in order to try to get my mind back together. But I did notice that part of it was having someone to talk to. And even though it's a mic on my head and it's electronic, and maybe this goes against what I've been saying a little bit, but at least it was something. I remember, if you go to a therapist, get mistaken for whatever crazy, and you get put into therapy, or you really need therapy, then you get someone to talk to, and there's this effect from just that. And sometimes you have to wonder, why is that person getting an effect? And I think the reason is because of isolation. If they weren't isolated, a therapist wouldn't have that same kind of effect. I don't think they'd be useless, especially in situations someone really has to work out their past. But that effect to me is evidence of some sort of isolation paradigm going on. And I think we need to understand that, to get a little bit more sophisticated, so that we don't try to replace our friendships, our intimate relationships with these digi relationships. We don't want to be what was his name? Christian Weston Chandler, guy who did Sonichu, who was autistic, and he just he can never create a normal social life outside of whatever message board that was on, and he had some website, who knows. Kind of interesting thing. Isolation, I think, also contributes to some people literally losing it. One of the things that seems to be the case with many people is they have very few friends. Many of these shooters have very few friends. Sometimes they're being treated, sometimes not. Often there's something going on where it's just something isn't clicking. They're not getting out of that isolation, and often their internet activity just indicates how lonely they are and how desperate they are for some sort of interaction. And we can't go to somebody who's pathological and go, hey, let's be friends, or the guy yelling to himself in the street, but pick him up and take him home with you. No, that's a pretty crazy idea. But to raise our children in a different way, and to allow that little bit, that loss of safety, and you feel guilty about it if something happens, I know, and that's kind of why we do that. But think about the effect of isolation and what that will have on them when the only thing they get is a play date, and they don't even really like the kid. You're just kind of shoving them in somebody else's house, and that's not fun. So we gotta think about this as something. It's definitely a subject that we need to mull over and to give it its due. And that's me. And I'll talk to you next time.